African Americans have been part of America's story from the beginning. As foot soldiers and fighting men, civilians and citizens, doing the dangerous job of whaling in the 19th century. (1619), the first Africans arrived in Virginia. Although some will gain their freedom and own land, most were slaves. Over 200 years, slavery became a key part of the American economy, particularly in the South. By 1861, nearly 4 million slaves. They helped to fuel a $2 billion cotton boom that makes the South rich.
The ghosts are very much alive today in people who have, if not the actual memory of that, but a family member of a memory of what that was like, and the social memory of what it was like when people were treated as things.
Now, in 1963, drawing on the inspiration of their deeper past, African Americans are about to change everything.
This country, once and for all, grasps the nettle of the most vexed issue in all of this country's history, which is race. We waited 100 years after the Civil War to take that issue up again.
The Civil War was fought in part over the right to own slaves. When it was over, African Americans were supposed to be on an equal footing. But segregation then took hold in the South.
And so you needed that second Civil War. I call it that. Others would not perhaps call it the same thing. But it was a different kind of Civil War, but it had the same goal as the first Civil War did. And it was led by different people.
20th century America will see a long struggle for equality. Race riots in Chicago in 1919 leave 38 dead. In the segregated South, separate schools, separate buses, separate restaurants. Twice as many unemployed. Change begins when 1 million black soldiers join up in World War II.
And blacks demonstrated they could fly planes just like anyone else. They could sail ships. They could do anything a white soldier could do.
They don't know it yet, but these soldiers are the beginning of the modern civil rights movement.
Individuals more than willing to fight and die for our country and for the freedoms that our country represented, yet freedoms that were not still truly shared by all Americans.
And the first step towards equal rights is taken. July 1948. The military is desegregated. No more whites-only regiments, no more blacks-only regiments. Just Americans, shoulder to shoulder.
When I came in, my superior said to me, "We don't care if you're black, we don't care if you're white, we don't want to hear any hard luck stories, the only thing we care about is performance."
But outside the military, it is a different story. Blacks do not have the same status as whites.
The people among us who in many cases were doing the dirty work of society, the people who were making the hotels ready for us to stay in and serving us food in restaurants that wouldn't seat them as guests.
The civil rights movement of the 1960s will use words and actions to convince the world that the time for freedom has come, that African Americans are ready to fight for justice.
So people say, "Why do you even identify yourself as black?" Because I'm black. And because everybody else would identify me as black, and did for most of my life. Now, they might not think that same way about my children, but I will not shrink from that. And the single reason why it won't is because of all those who went before me.
to put right the wrongs of slavery. That's what motivated those who went before.
Come on, y'all!
Blacks who, despite being enslaved, were already fighting for freedom. Inspirational people like Harriet Tubman,
Come on!
a former slave. From 1849, she was part of an underground network bringing some 300 slaves to freedom. One of America's first civil rights activists.
It's a story that's not just about black people, but it's about human beings caring for other people and having the courage to do what is right, even at peril to yourself.
The voice of the modern civil rights movement and its most determined and eloquent leader is Martin Luther King, Jr. Baptist minister, preacher, and campaigner. August 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. leads 250,000 in the March on Washington.
His marvelous speech that every American knows at the Lincoln Memorial, talking about I have a dream.
America is telling the world that blacks and whites have come together to say we're ready to make the next step toward equality. And a young black preacher talked about a dream that connected back to the American dream.
What he did was hold a mirror up to the face of all Americans and said, hey, it's been a couple of 100 years. Now let's do what the Declaration of Independence actually said.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The promise of 1776 back on the agenda.
Now this is a culmination of everybody together saying, this is our moment. This is the time for us.
Whites looked inside themselves and said, you know what, why should black kids go to second-rate schools? That's not good for the country. That's not good for what we are as a people. That's when the tipping point was reached.
A year after the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act is passed through Congress. Voting rights extended. Racial discrimination outlawed, segregation ended. America's problem with race does not disappear. But the way is paved for an African American to reach the White House.
To be able to inspire our kids and let them know that they have such greatness out there. They can be anything they want to be, and we can mean that.
Fighting segregation and discrimination by law, and we're changing hearts and minds. We're moving out of that, and memories tend to fade, but not for me. I'll never.
So here we have the timeline for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. First major court case that we see is Brown v. Board of Education, and this basically overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, Plessy said that segregation based on race was okay as long as facilities were separate but equal. In 1954, Brown versus Board said that segregation was not legal, especially in public schools. Now, kind of starting all of this as well is Rosa Parks, who was a civil rights leader. She helped in Montgomery, Alabama, to boycott buses that were segregating based on race. And African Americans of that community refused to ride the public buses until the city changed their law. And that took about a year to do. One of the main tactics to fight racial segregation was civil disobedience, which was peaceful protest or nonviolent ways of fighting unfair laws. This was spearheaded or led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as other groups. One of the more famous protests was the March on Washington, which tried to push President Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act that would end public segregation. And the March on Washington did have a large impact on President Johnson passing that law. Again, the goal of the March on Washington was to end segregation, and this is when one of the most famous speeches by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was given. While political and social equality was a major goal of the civil rights movement, as time went on, people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. encouraged President Johnson to deal with issues of poverty in America, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans dealing with poverty. Johnson's plan was called the Great Society, and he instituted things like Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, and other laws to help improve the economy. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a law with a series of pieces of legislation stating that states cannot discriminate against anyone due to their race, religion, sex, etc. when it comes to voting. Different than the nonviolent civil disobedience protests was the Black Power movement, and this took shape in the late 1960s, mid-1960s with Malcolm X, and eventually the Black Panthers in California, where many African Americans were responding to violence with self-defense and violence. Many felt that the tactics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. weren't effective or quick enough, and too many African Americans were being brutally beat up, and some of them killed and murdered because of their peaceful protests. Okay, in this section, we're going to take a look at a graphic organizer that's going to hopefully give you a visual that will help make sense and categorize some important ideas. So the first thing we want to look at is the topic, which is the Civil Rights Movement. And this is about the struggle for social, political, and economic equality or freedom in the United States. And the three main areas we have are social, political, and then there are other groups who are also fighting for civil rights at this time. Not as large as a population as African Americans doing this, but a very important movement. So the two main forms of civil disobedience that African Americans used at this time were sit-ins and boycotts. Again, sit-ins are where African Americans would go to segregated establishments and refuse to leave until they were served. Many were met with violence. In addition to Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and many other important figures in the peaceful movement, there was also the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they led a lot of peaceful sit-ins and nonviolent demonstrations. Many times children were part of it as well, which when on TV really upset a lot of people to see children being arrested or beat up by police. Again, the main difference with the Black Power movement is that many African Americans in this movement refused to stand by while they were being beat up by police and other racist Americans, and therefore felt that to fight back was a better method. Not only that, but particularly the Black Panthers used to serve breakfast for poor inner city youth, as well as provide daycare and job training as well for African Americans in the community. After the Brown decision, Little Rock, Arkansas was one of the first schools that was going to be integrating their black and white students in the community, and the governor of the state of Arkansas refused to do so. Eventually, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to send part of the military in to protect African Americans so that they were able to go to school. It was a very scary and dangerous experience for those young African American high school students who were being the first to integrate in all white schools. Many women started to question their roles in society in America at this time, and the feminist movement took hold in the 1960s. One of the major court cases was Roe versus Wade, which established that women who become pregnant, it is their right to choose whether or not they want to have a family, with certain restrictions on that that states are allowed to have. The Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, but it was pushed through Congress as a way to specifically state that public and private facilities cannot discriminate against women, particularly in pay, but that did not pass and has not passed to this day. And one of the major influences was a book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique, which really put to question the role of women in society. Should they be at home taking care of families, have the opportunity to go to college and become educated, etc. Many Mexican Americans had been migrating to the U.S. as farmers in the South wanted Mexican labor to help their production. And many were not treated well, were paid very poorly, and they were led by Cesar Chavez at the time to fight for more equality, but particularly for better pay. Native Americans had a group called the American Indian Movement, seeking to improve their lives, as many were forced onto reservations about 100 years ago, and the quality of life was deteriorated. Poverty was high, alcoholism was high, a lot of social issues. And when there was a standoff with the federal government at Wounded Knee, many were killed, and it brought to light a lot of the poor conditions that Native Americans were living in under the current system. In the 1970s, there was a push for Americans with disabilities to get more equality through public services and in public facilities, such as on-ramps, etc., for physically disabled, and for intellectually disabled, assistance in job training as well as care and other things. So overall, a lot of different movements coming together. Once you take a look at this, what you'll want to do is go down and see what they all have in common and what you think the big idea is for this unit.